Hello and welcome back. My name is Sundown, and this is Logically Free Spirited, where I talk about all things scientific and spiritual while remaining grounded yet open minded. And if you are new here, I don't know how you got here because this is part of a series and you shouldn't be here yet. So I will link back to the beginning of this somewhere on the screen and in the description box below. So we will see you back here soon. Okay. Should be just friends left, so let's get into it. Welcome back to my deep dive into the Telepathy Tapes podcast. As mentioned, this is part of a series, and today we will be talking about episode 3. And as a reminder, I plan to go over each episode of the podcast, outlining the stories and the experiments while expanding on ideas, theories, and more that they just didn't have time to get into. So please like and sub to follow along. The encouragement has been ineffable, and I can't thank everyone enough. But anyway, at this point, I think most of us are already starting to agree with our host, Kai, that the question is no longer, is telepathy real, but rather, how is telepathy real? And this video is going to follow that same line of thinking by starting with the experiments and then progressing into theory. So I hope that you stay to the second half because I think that's where it gets really, really interesting. Okay, so this episode starts with a mom in Georgia named Katy. Katy emailed Dr. Powell a few weeks after Kai returned home from interviewing and meeting with Akil in New Jersey. And after a few Zoom calls with them both, everyone decided it was time to head to the Atlanta area to meet Katy and her son in person. And by everyone, I mean Kai and Dr. Powell and a camera crew, but also Dr. Jeff Tarrant. He was that QEEG specialist from Mia's episode 1. And he brings along a hyperscanner, essentially a way to simultaneously scan two brains, like they did with Mia and her mom, Ileana, but slightly different. From the way I understand it, an EEG analyzes and quantifies brain waves to understand brain function, and a hyperscanner uses EEGs to study interactions between people, but also includes some additional processing and analysis, essentially examining how brains sync during interaction. The way it's discussed in the podcast makes it seem as though this is the first time they're using a hyperscanner with any one of the telepaths, but the description of it sounds really similar to the joint QEEG studies that we already saw done with Mia and her mom. So I'm not fully understanding the difference, but I think that's okay for now. We actually don't talk about the results of these tests until I think episode 6. I just wanted you to know that this is part of the testing that is done on this trip, but I won't be talking about it any further in this episode. Okay, so before moving on and getting into the discussed experiments, I want to introduce our next telepath, Houston. It's not clear how old Houston is, but I know he's in his 20s. His mom, Katy, is a single mom of 5, and Houston is the oldest. Signs of autism began showing when he was only 10 months old, and he was labeled as having severe autism. The most telling sign being a complete inability to remain still or control his behavior. And Katy's story is a heartbreaking one. She talks of isolation, of being made to feel bothersome, the ways in which the entire family, including her other children, feel ostracized from their community, which, by the way, I have been assuming that most people watching my videos have already listened to the Telepathy Tapes podcast, but please let me know in the comments. Have you guys already listened to the entire season? Are you going episode by episode along with me? And if so, which one are you listening to first? And have you started listening to the new talk tracks that Kai's been putting out? I ask all of this because Katy and Houston's story is so powerful. All of these families and their stories are so powerful. And I do my best to contribute to the conversation without simply repeating everything that is said in the podcast. But there is a lot of beauty and emotion and nuance that I leave out because that's not the purpose of my deep dives, at least not right now. And I just want to express that Kai infuses so much heart into the program, and I think that's why it's so important to listen to the podcast, not just other creators like me talking about it. I just don't want to gloss over the emotion because I'm not going to go into the details of Katy and Houston's backstory, although I find it to be profound and important. Also, all of the Telepathy Tapes episodes are now up on YouTube, so I will link them in the description box below. Anyway, Katy explains how routinely parents with severely autistic children are told to give up on them, how studies and evaluations continually reinforce the idea that their kids are just not in there. But Katy also shares how Houston's immense joy when watching the movie Flubber thankfully made this nearly impossible for her to believe. I think most of my audience is around my age, so hopefully everyone remembers Flubber, but if not, it's a gem, and I really miss Robin Williams.
When I hit the ground, the flubber will send me right back up, unharmed.
Anyway, Katy discusses losing her faith through a lot of hardships, but regaining it again when at 17 years old, Houston held still, looked her in the eyes, and said, "Mama, I love you," for the very first time. A miracle, as she defines it, that set everything in motion. She explains that a psychologist told her about the rapid prompting method, which is very encouraging considering in episode 2, we talked all about how organizations like ASHA are very anti any form of spelling. But this doctor did provide her with some information as well as a phone number to another mom who had a son like Akil who was now typing himself. Like Eliana and Manisha, Katy was skeptical, but not of the spelling method. She was actually skeptical that it could ever be possible for someone with such severe autism like Houston to get the physical control necessary to be capable of spelling. But because Katy is a super mom, it was possible. And by the age of 21, Houston wrote his first sentence. Houston communicates with a black plastic letterboard that has the letters and numbers punched out. And Katy holds it still while Houston uses a pencil to poke all the way through the intended letters one by one. Now, I have been learning so much about this as I do research and film and work on each of these videos. And I haven't really understood why the moms or the communication partners have to be the ones holding the letterboards. I mean, if they just need to be held still, why couldn't anyone do it? Or why couldn't it be put on a stand or a podium of some sort? I don't know the answer to this, but here is what I do know. I know that there is training involved with these supported typing methods, not just for the speller, but for the communication partner as well. And I know that part of that training involves learning to really quiet your mind. I also know that at least at the time of the experiments, Dr. Powell nor Kai had been trained in this kind of communication. Only Katy had, hence she's the one that has to hold the letterboard. But finally, I also know, or at least I'm 95% sure, that Kai is currently in training herself. So maybe once she's done, maybe by the next season, she'll be able to participate in the experiments. Regardless, I don't know exactly why someone has to be trained to hold the letterboard, but I do know that there is more to all of this than any one of us can understand without participating ourselves. It was in another interview that I'll link below that someone said something along the lines of, isn't it funny or interesting how in materialism, seeing is believing, but when it comes to telepathy, it seems as though believing leads to seeing. And this makes me want to add that there have been a lot of people in the comments asking how voice users and speakers can become able to telepathically communicate. And I don't have the answer for that either. I myself am not telepathic, at least not yet, but this makes me think of the Bannister effect. It was named after Roger Bannister, an English neurologist who in the 1950s was the first recorded human to run a sub 4-minute mile. Before he had accomplished it, it was thought to be physically impossible to run that fast. But after he did accomplish it, and once it had been done and proven and recorded to others, several other athletes then also ran a sub 4-minute mile within a year. And I guess I'm just saying that this gives me hope that now that people are coming to see and believe that telepathy is truly occurring, maybe more of us will be able to remember and tap into this ability. The new sub-series that I mentioned, the talk tracks that Kai's doing, has 2 episodes out right now at the time of recording this. And Kai interviews speaking people who are, or at least claim to be, telepathic in some way. So it might be wishful thinking, or it might be the inevitable future. But either way, I'm going to maintain gratitude and continuing my meditation practice in case it helps. Anyway, oh my God, what a digression. What was I talking about? Letterboards. Houston uses a letterboard that Katy holds, and Houston also verbalizes his letters and his numbers as he pokes through them, which to me is just another reason to believe that his communication is his own. Kai explains that after learning to spell and communicate, a lot of these families go through a get to know you phase where they discover who their children really are, what they like, what they dislike, what they know, what they care about. And this leads into how Katy came to believe that Houston was telepathic. She learned that, like the others, Houston knew all sorts of information that he was never taught in school, including finding out that he loves history and he's able to correctly recall things like the specific dates of important historical events. She asked him how he learned all of this. She asked if he had really good hearing, if he just overheard the teachers in other classrooms or something. But he said, "I'm special. I can read thoughts." He also told her where he'd been learning everything, and we'll get to that at the end of this video. But Katy also asked if he was telling the truth, and he added, "You don't get these kinds of gifts if you lie." Like the other mothers, she tested him herself, and it was clear not only was he reading her mind, it turns out that Houston can apparently read everybody's mind. Houston says he doesn't remember a time when he wasn't telepathic, and he added that everyone with non-speaking or unreliably speaking autism apparently has this ability to an extent. Now, I know there will be people that want me to highlight again that this is not just occurring within the autism community, but that is what we are exploring for now for the sake of sticking with the program. So now that we know Houston a little bit, let's get into the experiments. Unlike Akil, Houston was not bothered in the slightest by the chaos of the camera crew, which was so surprising to me because film sets are generally overwhelming for anyone that's not used to them, let alone someone with a heightened sensory experience. I have worked on sets since 2019, so 6 years now, and I can attest that even the smallest production comes with an abnormal amount of chaos, but it doesn't bother Houston. Kai finds him smiling and saying hello to everyone as they begin to unload and take over his home and set up for the day. Despite Houston's comfort, Kai calls for a closed set during the experiments to minimize the opportunity for any confusion that might arise with so many beings and therefore potential voices bouncing around the room. If Houston can hear everybody, best not to complicate things. As Dr. Powell is on this visit, everything is a little bit more formal than it was with Akil. And the first experiment, like the others so far, is done with a random number generator, but this time it's on Kai's phone. This experiment isn't on the website, but from the description, I believe that Dr. Powell is standing behind Houston, using the number generator and showing it to Katy without Houston seeing, and then Houston correctly spells or pokes the number. Like with everyone else, they did this experiment repeatedly before moving on, and Houston was correct 100% of the time. The second experiment was a little different and involved an Uno deck, and some of this experiment is on the website. Again, this time we can see that Dr. Powell is behind Houston, who is seated at a table in front of her alongside Katy, and there are 2 letterboards in front of him. One with letters and one with numbers and symbols. Dr. Powell then flips the card outward away from herself, so she doesn't actually see the face of the card, but it is facing the camera. It's also facing the back of Houston's head. And from there, Katy just has to look slightly over her shoulder to see the card. And instantly, Houston spells the correct information. The first one was 6 blue. They go again, and this time the number is +2. I think it was yellow. Again, Houston was correct, meaning he even got the plus symbol. And this is very endearing when you watch it or listen to it because you hear the earnest surprise emanating out of everyone. No one was expecting that card to be in the deck, let alone get pulled up. And no one was expecting Houston to get the plus symbol. It was just very neat. Like the first experiment, they do this repeatedly, including a rapid fire round that is also on the website. And again, Houston makes zero mistakes. They also go on to do book experiments, like the ones they did with Mia and Akil. However, they go even further by using a Bible in effort to derive more complex language to test him with. And yet, again, no mistakes. Finally, in terms of experiments, there's a really sweet conversation with one of the production crew members who was bummed to have to leave the room when Kai closed the set. When everyone was taking a break and not doing formal testing, in so many words, he told Katy that he wished he could have been in the room when Houston was doing the experiments versus watching it through a monitor outside or somewhere else in the house. So Katy had him write down a word then and there, and then he walked into a room where Houston was sitting, just hanging out, I guess, and he thought, my word is friend, which is so endearing and sweet. But this also seems to be the only time where Katy doesn't know the word before Houston spells it. It doesn't seem like Sam, the production member, showed the word to Katy and then Houston read Katy's mind in order to spell it out. It's not explicitly said if she does or doesn't see it, but it really doesn't seem like it. And this supports what was said earlier, that Houston can read everyone's mind. I point this out specifically because in the formal experiments discussed, Katy does see the words or numbers that Houston then spells. But again, supposedly Houston can read everyone's minds. That's why they closed the set, which had me wondering, how do we know that Houston's even reading Katy's mind during the experiments? I mean, he could be reading Kai's or Dr. Powell's or the camera operators, right? I mean, everyone was looking at the number generator and the cards and the books. He could be reading any one of them or the entire room. Kai says they did experiments where other crew members wrote words like Sam did, and she didn't say if Katy saw those words, but I don't think that was the case. At least not in regards to this last scenario with Sam. And I'm sure we'll know more once the documentaries come out. But anyway, that kind of sums up the experiments with Houston. Kai even says in the podcast that she doesn't want to bore everyone with repeated descriptions of experiments that are all 100% accurate every single time. And personally, that's fine with me because, in my opinion, the experiments were not the most interesting part of this episode. Katy tells a story of a time a friend gave her some stones that she had prayed over. And I really wish that they had explained exactly what these stones were. Were they crystals? Were they gemstones? Were they river rocks? Were they rocks off the sidewalk? I then realized I don't technically know the difference between all of these things. So I did some research, and here's how I come to understand it. Crystals are a type of mineral with a structured molecular arrangement, meaning that their atoms form ordered repeating patterns that result in distinct shapes. All crystals are minerals, but not all minerals form crystals. And gemstones can be minerals, rocks, or even organic materials that have been cut and polished and are often used in jewelry. Some crystals can be gemstones, but not all of them. Gemstones are typically used for decorative purposes, while crystals have a broader range of uses, including in electronics and even medicine. Now, rocks are solid masses composed of one or more minerals or crystals, and a stone is generally regarded as just a smaller piece of rock. So essentially, stones can kind of be anything. And while all of these terms don't technically mean one and the same, it's very easy to see how they could be interchangeable. And while it's not directly defined in the episode, at one point, Kai does reference a large crystal quartz that belongs to Houston, which leads me to believe that the stones in this scenario are likely what we in the woo community often refer to as crystals, even when they aren't. For instance, substances like obsidian. Anyway, I am going to use stones because that is the word that Katy uses, and I truly don't know exactly what she's referencing, so stones it is. So Katy is given these stones, and shortly after getting home, Houston starts hunting around, slamming doors, and shouting about these stones. So Katy handed them over. She didn't know what to do with them anyway. A little while later, she goes to check on Houston in his room, and she finds him laying at the very edge of his bed, as close as he could get to his nightstand, where all of the stones were lined up in a neat little row in front of him. And he was just laying there in the presence of these stones. She also tells another story of these crystal dice that she had wrapped and hidden as a gift for one of her other sons. And when Houston got home from school, he immediately went and found the dice. It turns out that Houston had an unknown to Katy deep connection towards stones and crystals, and he was apparently able to find these hidden dice because of that connection. And Houston goes on to explain to his mom that when you're autistic, you are a magnet for all energy, good and bad, and said that the stones and crystals have good energy and he wants as much of that as he can get. Personally, my mom is a witch, or witch adjacent, and she has sent me so many crystals over the years, and I'm just even more grateful for them now than I was before. Anyway, Katy is awesome, and she leans into Houston's passions, and now his room is full of stones and crystals. She also leans into the research, and she discovered that all matter, including stones, have a Hertz frequency, and that some of them also contain piezoelectric energy. Now, what is piezoelectric energy? I hear no one asking. It is the conversion of mechanical energy into electrical energy by stressing or applying pressure to certain crystals or substances, which then generate a small electrical charge. This is used in items we use all the time, every day, like certain types of watches, touch screens, lighters, speakers, microphones, which, yes, I know my audio is not ideal. I'm working on it. But anyway, it's also used in radio transmissions. For example, in CB radios or radio transmitters and receivers, piezoelectric crystals like quartz can be oscillated at specific frequencies that match a radio wave's frequency, allowing someone to tune into a particular station or channel. Relative to this, Kai mentions Andrea Puharich, an American researcher and physician who received his medical degree from Northwestern in the 1940s. Puharich is known for many things, and while Kai doesn't elaborate, I will for just a second. Puharich is a mixed bag. If you check only his Wikipedia page, you would quickly come to learn that a lot of people consider him to be a credulous researcher and believe that he's not someone to be taken too seriously. But I think his story is really interesting. He is most known for being the person who brought the famed psychic Uri Geller from Israel to the United States for research in the 1970s. But Uri Geller also has mixed reviews, and that's a different story. My point is that Puharich was taken seriously, at least enough to be repeatedly granted funding by government entities like the Atomic Energy Commission and NASA to pursue his research and his experiments regarding psi phenomena. Puharich was fascinated by the concept of ESP, and he was particularly interested in how human hearing might overlap with telepathy in some way. While researching this, he studied psychiatric patients who had expressed hearing voices, and he came to discover that dental fillings could act as radio receivers, particularly if carborundum dust was involved. And carborundum dust, or powder, is made up of tiny particles of silicon carbide, a super hard material that is used in things like sandpaper or grinding and cutting tools. I found this particularly unpleasant when I realized this included dental tools, but I'm a baby that can't handle the dentist. So that's on me, not on the dentist. I'm sorry, any dentist. Anyway, Puharich encountered a patient that had this substance in his mouth and on his teeth from dental fillings, as well as from working in a machine shop. Once they determined that the disembodied voices he was hearing were actually intercepted radio waves, they cleaned his teeth and the voices stopped, thus saving countless others from potential wrongful institutionalization. And I just think that's really important. Take Lucille Ball, for example. As discussed in the podcast, her dental fillings contained the right compounds to pick up radio transmissions. The first time this happened to her, she was driving home from work and she heard music reverberating in her head. And then a few days later, she actually heard Morse code, which led her to end up helping the US military discover a secret underground Japanese base that was transmitting a signal. It's a fascinating story, and I've linked the full interview below. But bringing this all together, piezoelectric crystals can turn mechanical energy into electrical energy, and in turn, that energy can be used in transmissions, in things like cell phones and radios, forms of invisible communication. And why are we here, class? Telepathy, invisible communication. And this is the same conclusion that Katy and Kai come to also. Comparing thoughts to energy and questioning if telepathy could be a type of radio signal. Katy compares the telepaths' brains to cell towers and their thoughts to radio waves bouncing from one tower to another, transmitting information and communication. But radio signals aren't perfect. There are a lot of things that can cause static and interference. And according to Katy, the same is true for telepathy. Katy explains that anxiety, negativity, and hatefulness all cause immense interference in Houston's ability. And this makes me think of the producer from Akil's episode. Not his episode of the telepathy tapes, but my breakdown of his episode, episode 2, where I recount the story of Akil either no longer being able to or maybe simply not willing to communicate in front of a disbelieving and negative producer. My point is just that this tracks, and this could also be what prevents the rest of us from accessing this ability to an extent. Anyway, Katy believes that Houston is experiencing a greater range of the electromagnetic spectrum, and that this is what allows him to not only communicate telepathically, but she believes it's also what is responsible for his sensitivity to frequencies and wavelengths. All right, so I truly don't know how to transition into this last topic, but we've got to talk about the hill. In my very, very first episode about the telepathy tapes as a whole, I mentioned the hill, but this is the first time that it actually comes up in the podcast in episode 3. We first hear about it when Katy and Houston are in their get to know you phase, and Katy learns that Houston knows all of this information that he hadn't previously been exposed to. When she asked him how he knew all of these things, he did tell her he could read minds, like I mentioned earlier, but he also told her that he had been learning on the hill. And this ties into the radio discussion. Katy compares the hill to a channel on a CB radio, where non-speakers can essentially tune into the station and communicate and collaborate together telepathically. Going there to socialize and support one another, but also going there to learn and teach one another. So these autistic telepaths are communicating on this hill and with each other, not just with their parents. And this is I'm getting ahead of myself. I want to add that when this season was done and recorded, Kai learned that there's more than one hill, or essentially more than one channel or station to tune into and be a part of. Like, I think there's a main one, the hill, and then I'm not sure if you'd call them sub-channels, but essentially other channels or hills that may have specific focuses or interests that someone can tune into and be a part of. It sounds wild, but Katy tells the story of getting a message from a mom in another state, a mom that she had never met, whose son had spelled out that Houston was his best friend. And this makes no logical sense. They don't know each other. They've never met. They live in different states. How can they be friends? How can they be best friends? Apparently, the hill. And we're merely introduced to it in this episode, but we're going to go so much deeper into it with each next episode. But one thing I want to add from the jump is that everyone needs to make sure to leave the hill alone. It's not meant for us, and these people deserve to have a place of their own. And I'm saying this specifically to the remote viewers and the astral projectors. The kids say that they are fine and they're protected in this space, but that it's annoying when uninvited guests arrive and someone has to take time out of their experience to usher you out. So you should only be there if you're invited. And the good news is that there have been voice users like you and I that have been invited. We'll learn about at least one towards the end of the series, I believe. But in the new talk tracks that Kai's doing that I mentioned earlier, the first episode is actually with a friend of hers who has now been invited to the hill 3 times. And his story is incredible, and you should definitely go and listen to it. But I don't think I ever expected myself to be speaking directly to remote viewers and astral projectors about not accessing a telepathic channel meant primarily for autistic children with 100% sincerity. But it is 2025, a year that I still think only sounds like it should exist in Blade Runner. And every day I'm learning and discovering more incredible things that I didn't think was possible. So yeah, I guess I'm going to sign off. I'll see you guys next time when I break down episode 4, where we will meet John Paul and Lily. It should be about 2 weeks, hopefully less. And if you're still here, thank you. I truly can't thank you enough. This podcast has changed my life, from ontological shock to volunteering in my community to having the confidence and the drive to get on here and do this and put this out here. So I really appreciate all of you staying, and thank you so much. That's it. I love you. I'll see you later.